Attempts to calculate the improbability, or in turn the inevitability, of any particular human life surface every so often in our culture. A decade ago, in 2011, Dr. Ali Benazir posted an entry on the Harvard weblog that became a bit of an internet rage. It was a thought experiment that assigned probabilities to key moments leading to your existence. Your parents meeting, them getting pregnant with the very particular egg and sperm that led to your particular genetic makeup, and working backwards, all of those things happening with each set of your ancestors. His conclusion was that the probability of any one person existing is something like 1 in 10 to the 2,685,000. For everyone who replied that the probability of existence for something that actually exists already is exactly 1, Dr. Benazir emphasized that the probability of sentient life is not something that can be measured accurately, and hundreds of steps have been deleted for simplicity. It's all an exercise to get you thinking. And no matter how you slice it, it's pretty remarkable that you and I, self-absorbed scallywags that we are, stand at the end of an unbroken chain of life going all the way back to the primordial slime. That's the point. Dr. Benazir reposted this thought experiment earlier this year as a reminder of the wonder of life during a pandemic that has constantly reminded us of death. The general lesson is that the most improbable, amazing thing that any one of us could ever accomplish is just to exist. We've already done it. Having evolved the consciousness to understand and wonder at this, you might think that we humans would naturally be the most grateful, generous, kind, and wise creatures imaginable, but the horrifying reality, as you know, is otherwise. One could, for example, decide to spend this amazing and improbable existence protesting life-saving COVID vaccines outside a local hospital. Perhaps this is why you're more likely to hear me humming Monty Python's The Galaxy Song, with its ending that may fit better a society filled with conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers. We're 30,000 light years from galactic central point. We go around every 200 million years, and our galaxy itself is one of millions of billions in this amazing and expanding universe. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere out in space, because there's none at all down here on Earth. In my many conversations with earnest conspiracy theorists, climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, and others, what struck me is how these delusional beliefs are often rooted in a person's desire to be happy and to explain their unhappiness. Sometimes it's a desire to fit in with a group, to adopt beliefs and positions as an expression of belonging together. Sometimes it's an attempt to make sense of something that's baffling in the world, to give themselves a feeling of control amidst chaos or crisis. Sometimes I think it's just this inexorable slide toward mental ascent. Outrageous claims feel less improbable as they become more familiar with constant repetition. Combine those kinds of things with a culture that doesn't value or teach critical thinking skills or basic scientific knowledge and tools, then put us in the middle of multiple intractable crises. And we've got a recipe for disaster. We cling to delusion as we bear with our suffering to explain it, make sense of it, assign guilt and blame, and cope with our misery. This is our very human dilemma. The consciousness that allows us to wonder at the improbability and beauty of existence also makes us aware of the suffering and brutality of existence. How we respond to this dilemma makes all the difference. Wisdom teachers have pointed out for millennia that we tend to cope with some combination of 1, grasping for sense pleasures, indulging every hedonistic whim we can in an effort to distract, absorb, or escape. Or 2, pushing away anything, everything that's unpleasant, whether through anger or despair, violence or apathy. Or 3, attaching to our own self-views of who we are or who we'd like to become, constantly postponing our well-being in the present in deference to identifying with our achievements or even to some imaginary ideal about ourselves. Caught up in all this, the wonder of our existence escapes most of us most of the time. There are many complicated reasons for our individual responses, but for the moment, I'd like us to focus on one ubiquitous source of both our delusions and our unhappiness. For many, maybe, probably most of us, our lives are dominated with messages that reduce our worth to productivity and consumption. We're exhausted with constant comparisons and competitions and trapped in ruthless cycles of praise and blame. To survive in such a hostile system, we learn to internalize those oppressive, destructive messages. We then police ourselves, training our minds and our bodies to conform to destructive expectations around us in society. As a survival skill, this can be extraordinarily helpful. But if well-being is our goal, this is all exhausting and harmful. Unfortunately, the phenomenon happens in relation to every oppressive system and culture, from racism and sexism to gender and sexuality antagonisms to ableism and more. In the case of capitalism and economic injustice, we internalize that incessant pressure to demonstrate our value by being productive, and the incessant desire to signal our value to others by consuming the right products. This becomes the basis of our self-worth, an antagonistic relationship with ourselves, others, and society around us. Anders Hayden, a political science professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, describes some of the common impacts of internalized capitalism in terms of its dehumanization. He said, "You can't feel value in yourself just for being alive, just for being a human being. You have to be a human doing to have any value." As a result, we tend to identify with the work we do. We tend to assess our place in society based on the social values that have been assigned to our employment. We tend to have a difficult time giving ourselves permission to rest or judge ourselves as lazy or as failures if we don't work constantly. We tend to undervalue our own well-being. Internalized capitalism combines with other oppressive systems to reinforce disparities. For example, systemic racism and ableism make it more difficult for people who are not white or people who are disabled to access educational and employment opportunities that society puts a high value on, redirecting them toward underappreciated and overexploited professions. And that tidy system both reinforces prejudices of inferiority, while it also justifies exploiting their labor. Hayden connects this tendency with the grasping for certainty that accompanied the old Calvinist teachings on predestination and the so-called Protestant work ethic. He wrote, "The Calvinists had this incredible doubt of whether they were worthy, and to prove that they were worthy, they had to be able to show that they could be continually industrious and continually producing and frugal as well." Can you feel the differences becoming clear? There is a huge gap between doing something in order to prove that you're worthy and doing something to express love, joy, or compassion. In the former, we have to constantly outshine our competitors. We have to grab all that we believe we're entitled to grab, what we earn, what we deserve, and then we have to defend it from others. In the latter, we participate in an abundance of life. We live with compassion rather than in competition. But for any of us socialized into production and consumption, that takes a lot of training of the mind. For myself, there's a very simple chant from the Buddhist tradition that's been a vital part of my daily practice for many years now. My very life is sustained through the gifts of others. It's not a new insight, but it is one that is easily forgotten, easily drowned out. And that's why it's included in a chant called 10 Subjects for Frequent Recollection, which I first encountered in the Thai forest tradition of Buddhism. With a title like that, you probably aren't surprised that there's a lot of repetition involved. It's a common technique to help with memorization, to reflect the process of building and keeping habits, and to support focusing and concentrating the mind. So for each of the recollections, all 10 of them, you would chant after the recollection, "This should be reflected upon again and again by one who has gone forth." Adding the reflection bit here is key. The recitation helps train the mind to pay attention in a certain way, tells you what you need to be on the lookout for as you go through your day. And then the reflection helps you recognize insight and understanding when you do notice it. It's not one and done. We reflect again and again. This acknowledges that new habits of thinking and doing take time and practice to establish, especially if we are unlearning and healing from internalized oppression. In the Buddhist tradition, a person who wants to prioritize this kind of training can do it full time, become a monastic, and dedicate their life to reflecting again and again. This brings us to that next phrase, right? One who has gone forth. For a monastic has left home, left secular employment, left all the pleasures, conveniences, and the illusion of security of the socially expected. We can connect that with our experience today of internalized capitalism. When you see a tradition like a Buddhist monastic, it gives you an option of choosing a lifestyle completely out of step with the capitalist values of production and consumption. The monastics are sometimes described as owning nothing. And many traditional orders still go on alms rounds in their communities every morning to receive their daily bowl of rice. Their lives are quite literally dependent on their neighbors' generosity for food, medicine, shelter, and clothes. And that's the original context for reflecting, my very life is sustained through the gifts of others. I'm not a monastic, but I still chant these words, and I still find a lot of value in them, usually every day as part of training my mind. The repetition has been a key part of the ongoing work of undoing internalized capitalism, and the shift in perspective is continuously liberating, at least for me. I'm invited to reflect on how I relate to life, how I might relate to life a little differently, how I relate to others and the earth itself with more gratitude, open-heartedness, and joy. I often catch myself throughout the day reflecting on this little phrase. I think, my very life. Well, what does that mean? My very life. Not the life I've imagined, not my perceptions and desires, and not the expectations I've been socialized to believe are real, but the actual very life that exists in this moment. This very life is breathing, eating, drinking, laughing, singing, playing, reading, teaching, supporting and caring for others, cleaning, sleeping, caring for the body. My very life is made up of a lot of very silly jokes, painful toothaches, cooking meals for friends, savoring a cup of hot tea, and watching the butterflies sip nectar from the New England asters at our patio. It also means the intimate and intricate microbiome that has evolved with humanity, each one of us a walking universe of eukaryotes, archaea, bacteria, and viruses living on and in us, whose cells outnumber the cells we call human by as much as 10 to 1. In many cases, we depend on these microorganisms as much as they depend on us for functions from digestion to our immune responses. And on the macro scale, my very life cannot be separated from the lives of my ancestors, the good ones and the bad ones, whose genes live on in me. Nor can I sever myself from the billions of other humans I share this planet with. My very life, it turns out, includes much that I would otherwise ignore or forget about. These reflections shatter the illusion that I am somehow utterly independent or that I can ultimately separate out my life and well-being from the lives of others. We are intimately connected in so many ways. This is part of the meaning of that next phrase that tells us my very life is sustained, which reminds me that my life is not permanent and it's not guaranteed. My body is this amazing, wondrous process, and it's amazingly resilient considering all I've put it through during these years I've been here on earth, but it's also so dependent on things outside my immediate control. Think, for instance, about how our lives are sustained just by the air we breathe, in which we share with every other living being on this planet. If we can do so, we'll find that each breath is a gift, if I'm willing to remember it as the amazing process it really is. Do you know, for example, the average human breath contains about 25 sextillion molecules that we share, constantly cycle through with all other living beings. A sextillion has 21 zeros in every breath. To look at it another way, Ethan Siegel, answering the question, how many atoms do we have in common with one another, wrote that, quote, right now, if you take a deep breath and then exhale, by the time a year, just 1 year goes by, approximately one atom from that breath will wind up in every other person on Earth's lungs at any moment in time. Every time you breathe in, you're breathing atoms of air that were once inside another human being. Every time you take a drink of water, you're drinking water that was once inside another human being. Every bite of food you take consists of atoms that were inside another person. He goes on to write, we all share the same planet, the same biosphere, and at a fundamental level, even the same atoms. At an atomic level, we're all incredibly, deeply connected. Inside your body right now are hundreds of billions of atoms that were once inside each other human being on Earth. Throughout the generations and the eons, these same atoms continue to make up everything. The atoms of the dinosaurs, the plants, the trilobites, and even the single-celled organisms that once dominated our planet are now inside you. He concludes, it's your turn now. We could never deserve any of this. We can't earn the opportunity to live. It's all a gift. And if our hearts are open, we understand that the very lives of others are also sustained through the gifts we share with them. We're part of this cycle of giving and receiving. We become free from the fears that systems like capitalism instill in us, fear of losing status and reputation, fear of not consuming the expected things in the expected way so that other people will think we're great people, and the looming fear of not being worthy of care, life, or love. Like one who has gone forth, we can embody this freedom and savor the joys of generosity, kindness, and love. A human being, if she is a true human being, Thich Nhat Hanh taught us, is enough to make the whole world rejoice. In what would be his final Christmas sermon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observed that we're all interdependent. He said, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Our lives and choices affect one another whether we like it or not. King insisted that we are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality, our well-being bound up together. He asked, did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. Then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee in the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea. That's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you've finished eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way the universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. As King knew so very well, there is so much that is unjust in this world, so much unnecessary suffering. But King also knew, in his words, that we will never have peace in the world until humans everywhere recognize that ends are not cut off from means, because the means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. And ultimately, you can't reach good ends through evil means, because the means represent the seed and the end represents the tree. Our movements for social change and our daily practices for changing ourselves need to hold all of this together. We need to be with the injustice and suffering with unflinching honesty. We need to be with the goodness with the same kind of honesty. We need to carry both grief and gladness within us. We mourn what is wrong, even as we appreciate everything that has to go right for us to even be able to know that something has gone wrong. We don't diminish injustice, but we also do not diminish joy. By doing so, we stay grounded in well-being and aligned with what makes fighting for peace and justice worthwhile in the first place. It takes time and it takes practice to remember that my very life is sustained through the gifts of others. But all of this is possible, and we can do it. It is made up of our normal, everyday human lives. It is simply the gift of being alive. Whatever world we sustain, it will be our choice. We can heal the suffering born of greed, hatred, and delusion. And we can bring into existence communities filled with generosity and compassion and truth. We have this right now, this one amazing gift of life to live. Let's live in such a way that the whole world will rejoice. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.